For speaker of the policy.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it is no secret that the current voting system favors specifically the rich countries. It is a policy such as the fact that the president of the World Bank is always an American, or the president of the International Monetary Fund is always European, and that there is the exact type of politics that need to be addressed for us to promote inclusivity and fairness, which is crucial for the World Bank to be able to achieve its objectives, which is the most important aspect of this debate. Panel, what is our stance proposition? We tell you we're in favor of a one country, one vote system, where all member countries, 189, have an equal voting power, as opposed to the current status quo, where the amount of country contributes dictates their voting power. Panel, as proposition, all we have to prove to you in this debate is two things. Number one, justify the need for the one country, one vote system. And number two, prove to you how imposing this new system would help the World Bank achieve its objectives. Panel, I'll do this by presenting to you an argument on how imposing this system would dismantle the World Bank political hegemony. The first setup. Panel, what is the problem with the current system? 3 problems. The first can be seen with the obvious fact that the World Bank has failed to achieve its objectives, which are to end extreme poverty and promote shared prosperity. Panel, tell you since 1944, no meaningful shared prosperity has been achieved whatsoever. Now, yes, we can agree that there has been somewhat of an improvement in the human welfare of countries. However, the gap between rich and poor has grown even more dramatic. Panel, 80 years has passed since the World Bank has been set up, and developing countries that include Tanzania and Morocco still remain the largest borrowers from the World Bank. Right? We tell you, instead of ending extreme poverty, the World Bank in itself has been facilitating the continuous cycle of the debt trap, keeping developing countries just that, developing. Panel, the second problem is the politicization of the World Bank. Understand that the US, alongside the Western European and Japan, collectively form the majority of votes within the World Bank. Hence, they literally control the World Bank. Why is this a problem? Panel, the US understands are merely using the World Bank as a tool to impose their will on any country they may not agree with politically. Right? They do this by selecting directors with their ideology, or then select staff that think in similar ways. Panel, why do you think locals in Cuba are still driving cars in the 1960s? They don't like it. They do that because the World Bank cut them off. They don't get funding from the World Bank. Why? Because Cuba and the US don't agree politically. And so the US influenced the World Bank to cut them off. Not to mention, the contribution that the US gives to the World Bank comes from stolen money. All the money the US gives to the World Bank comes from mineral wealth. In Tanzania, for example, they come to our country, steal our tanzanite, profit off of it, and then use that profits to coerce us. Panel, this is unjust. Moving on. The third problem is the lack of shared accountability. Right? Understand, the US has massive swaying power over the actions of the World Bank. That includes who the World Bank lends money to. For example, in the past, the US was threatened by China's potential. So what did it do? It opposed any sort of loans being given to China. Panel, the fact that in 1971, for example, the US was able to remove the US dollar from the gold standard, making its currency invaluable, and no country would raise a voice. Is the exact type of politics that need to be changed in the current voting system. Panel, by imposing this new system, we tell you the US, if it wants to do anything, it has to strongly justify it. As opposed to right now, where it can do anything and get away with it. Panel, how can we justify this new system? Right? 2 ways. The first, economic equity. We tell you, rich countries have created an extractive economic model that is built on exploitation. The loans that are given to these countries are geared towards building infrastructure to transport minerals present in Tanzania and in other developing countries. Now, yes, this does help the local Tanzanians or the local Moroccans have some nice fancy bridges, some nice fancy highways. However, these bridges don't serve the local Moroccans, they don't serve us, they do serve the multinational companies that are buying our resources while we sleep. Now, the the one country, one vote system helps boost economic equity in the following ways. Number one, we can influence policies that give us funds that develop our secondary sector through manufacturing. Number two, it gives countries a seat at the table where they can advise on tailored economic problems. The second justification, common law. Panel, majority of countries that receive loans from the World Bank are developing countries, Tanzania and Morocco, for example, which means we are the countries that are paying the most in interest, which means the World Bank makes most of the revenue from us, developing countries. The irony here is although we are literally the basement, the contributors to the World Bank's success, we have no say in how the World Bank is run. And I will tell you, as the most active stakeholders, we deserve a say in the way the World Bank is run because we contribute significantly to its success. I'll take one, POI.
So, you've spoken about the gold standard and how it was enforced by institutions such as the World Bank. But how do decisions made by sovereign entities such as the Federal Reserve have to do with the motion, being an international institution?
Right, we tell you that the USA has massive swaying power for the World Bank. And so they do that, they literally control, and I mentioned this in my speech, they can control what the World Bank does. And because the US has backing from the Union, what they can achieve they're not keeping them accountable. Moving on to my argument. How would a one country, one vote system dismantle the World Bank political hegemony? We tell you that literally the World Bank is supposed to be a democratic institution. However, in the current status quo, it bases all its actions on what a few countries think. Now, the proposition, yes, we understand there will always be politics, but how are the politics better on our side? Panel, we give collective bargaining power to all member countries and not just a few. This is right. Why? Now, honestly, we are perfectly happy with African and Asian countries coming together to pass policies that benefit them and their regions, right? So let's say Ethiopia wants a loan for a bridge, right? This looks like the AU backing them up. That's 54 votes right there and then, Cameron. Moving on, I know for a panel, we know opposition to come up and tell us, oh, if I impose this new system, there'll be less contributions. This is false. Why? Panel, on our system, understand, if we impose this one country, one vote system, the World Bank is more likely to implement and consider what other countries think. Countries such as China, France, big economies, right? And because they're more likely to consider and implement what they think, they'll be more incentivized to contribute more, because now they're comfortable with how their money is being used. Right? We tell you that countries already funding the World Bank will continue to fund them. Why? Because they are interested in a thriving global economy. We tell you the US itself will continue funding. Why? Because they want to keep its dominance. They can't afford to be substituted by China or Germany or France. They will keep contributing the money that they are right now. In contrast, we tell you in the current voting system, the USA is the only country incentivized to contribute. Why? Simply it wants to keep its dominance. It doesn't care about no country besides itself. The US and Europe have all the bargaining power and are using the World Bank as a tool for the political balance and exploit developing countries. What are the impacts of this on our side? We told the countries will form political blocs that will challenge the current hegemonic structure. How this happens? Three ways. Number one, inclusivity and representation. We told you we ensure on our side all stakeholders have a say in the decision-making process, which helps to avoid the marginalization of developing countries. Second thing, checks and balances. We prevent a single entity from making all the decisions, reducing the likelihood of abuse of power. We help ensure fairness, accountability, and transparency in the voting process, which is crucial to help the World Bank achieve its objectives. Number three, long-term stability. We told you that considering the interests of all member countries, decisions made are more sustainable and durable, leading to long-term stability and satisfaction. Panel, I promise you in my speech I'll prove to you on how we can justify this new system and how on our side we help the World Bank achieve its objectives, and I've done just that. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed judges, and honorable members of this House, today I stand before you as the first speaker of the opposition team, strongly upholding the motion of interest that the World Bank should institute a one country, one vote system. And while we do recognize the noble intentions behind this proposal, we firmly believe that it would lead to detrimental consequences for not only the World Bank, but also the global community at whole. In today's debate, I'll be doing four things. Firstly, brief characterization. Secondly, rebuttal. Thirdly, I'll present my first argument about less funding overall. Fourthly, I'll present my second argument about the bad decisions. And the second speaker will give you the third argument about why there will be less accountability on team propositions side. Okay, for the brief characterization, I would like to emphasize once and for all that implementing a one country, one vote system would undermine the very purpose of the World Bank, which is to foster global economic development and to reduce poverty. The World Bank, as it stands today, operates on a voting system that considers financial contributions and economic influence. By diluting the system, we seriously risk jeopardizing the bank's ability to make informed decisions. Now, let's address the main rebuttal that the supporters of the motion have raised today. They argue that the current system is inherently biased towards the powerful nations and that it marginalizes the votes of the developing countries. But however, we are here to tell you all that it is simply not the case that the developing countries have no say. In fact, these countries like India, Brazil, and Turkey are the top 20 voting powers in the World Bank. Plus, the WBO has already made some reforms. I've said that since 1998 they haven't been speaking at all, notably in 2010 to increase the power of developing countries by giving them greater representation in the World Board of Executive Directors. And Prop's model goes like a step too far and shifts the balance and how the radical way donors would most certainly decrease funding. So in their world, what would happen? There would be less funding in their world, which I will speak about more in my first argument, and it is the main argument of this, and I'll be speaking about later. Additionally, talking about the loans that Team Proposition mentioned, shockingly, many developing countries actually care about the development outcomes of the developing countries, which is something that you guys completely disregarded, both morally and because it is in their own interest to have a strong partners to trade with. That is why the World Bank is operating the way that it is, and that is why, because the economically developed countries have a say for the developing countries, where everybody is included. Okay. Now, I will be moving on to my first argument about the less funding overall. The impact of the proposition's policy is the donor contributions, which are very essential to funding development projects and loans. And let me tell you all that in their world, they will significantly decrease. In the proposed one country, one vote system, big contributors such as the United States will no longer have a say in decision making. I'll be talking about later. This perception that their interests may not be met will likely lead to a reduction in funding. And there are three reasons for this shift in incentives. Firstly, big contributors already face domestic pressure to decrease foreign spending and allocate more funds to domestic affairs. Now, seeing that their funding may be misused without proportional voting system will further amplify this pressure, and it will only continue to do so. Secondly, not having a significant say over the allocation of funds create uncertainty for big contributors, and they may potentially question the value of investing a substantive amount of money when the outcome is uncertain. And thirdly, big contributors want voting power to ensure that funding aligns with their goals and priorities. And while they do not seek to exploit borrowing countries, contrary to what Team Prop has to say, they want to support projects that benefit both themselves and their borrowers. In the proposed systems, their interests are very unlikely to be met. We guarantee that. Now, the arguments of the impact of this argument are very profound. What are these impacts? Reducing funding would deprive developing countries of the support needed to improve their economies. Furthermore, big contributors, when reducing their contributions, are more likely to allocate funds and other partnerships outside of the World Bank, which is not something we're trying to say, because these countries do count on this. And this lack of coordination among different lenders to duplicate projects and insufficient resource utilization and potential inefficiencies in developing efforts is very valid. Additionally, countries may resort to lenders like China, who are very known for having coercive loan conditions, very bad loan conditions, which trap countries in debt and dependence. Now, comparatively, in the status quo, big contributors continue to increase their funding to compete for voting power. This trend benefits underdeveloped and developing countries as they can finance their projects within the World Bank's regulated framework, fostering a sense of shared responsibility and collective problem solving. Is this not what we all want? That is why in Team Proposition, we have a superior funding mechanism, and this is why the World Bank is able to thrive in our world. I'll be taking the Q&A.
Please answer this. The Morocco problem sending its principal ambassador as a representative for permanent residency to the World Bank. as permanency to the World Bank.
Okay, we would just like to say that this is completely irrelevant to what we are trying to say, because the loans, you were saying that the countries count on these loans. We are the ones that are being able to loan. So if we do count with your model, these loans will not be able to be brought to the World Bank, and the World Bank will never even be able to function thoroughly. I will now be moving on to my second argument, which has to do with bad decisions. So the focus of our arguments lies in the detrimental consequences that such a system would have on decision making, particularly regarding poorly considered and inefficient outcomes. The decisions made within the World Bank are of the utmost importance, and we cannot stress this enough. It is evident that under a one country, one vote system, the likelihood of poorly made decisions increases significantly, regardless of whether big contributors reduce their spending or not. This stems from three compelling reasons that highlight the flaws inherent in the proposed system. Firstly, the lack of expertise among countries with limited financial contributions poses significant obstacles to informed decision making. These countries simply lack the necessary resources to invest in building robust institutional capacity, and it hinders their ability to allocate resources towards developed, specialized skills, conducting comprehensive research, and even accessing the expertise required to make decisions. And this limitation extends not only to the developing countries, but also to the wealthy states that lack familiarity with specific development policies and projects. Now, and secondly, the one country, one vote system would inherently lead to slower decision-making processes. This expanded numbers of decision makers makes it significantly and increasingly challenging and time-consuming to establish agreements among a broader set of countries. Deadlocks are more likely to occur as it becomes harder to resolve non-majority opinions. Moreover, the time required to brief all countries, including those with no significant stake in the matter at hand, would considerably impede the flow of decision-making, resulting in significant delays for projects that may be crucial for the country's development. Lastly, the incentives for countries that have minimal stake or financial contributions in the World Bank to actively engage and make well-formed decisions may be lacking. Passive voting or aligning with allies based on political alliances may prevail, leading to wasted or distorted votes that undermine the very balance that the proposition seeks to advance. The impact of these arguments is very profound. Countries in dire need of financial assistance and development support will suffer as the loans and investment conditions they require will not be readily available. These delays hinder their economic process and impede their ability to address pressing challenges. In contrast, the current system strikes a delicate balance, ensuring that developing countries still have significant say in decision-making while benefiting from the expertise and investments of the major contributors. Panel, on our side of the world, we take into consideration the academic aspects without disregarding the other reasons. For all these reasons, we are still proud to oppose.
Team opposition live in a theoretical world. They live in a world where we have not been oppressed by the West. They live in a world where the World Bank has not been used to oppress developing nations. And the very fact that they live in this world, they fail to actually tackle the problems that the World Bank is actually currently facing. Their burden is to justify to us that in this current oppressive system that exists within the current status quo, why is it then justified and why is it just for us to continue with this oppressive system? And fail to tell us that the continuation of the oppressive system is, we assume because we tell you it's unjust, and the very fact that it's unjust, regardless of their outcomes panel, we cannot operate under an oppressive system within the current status quo. What do they tell you? Three things. They tell you there will be less incentive, they can tell you that there's less accountability, and they tell you bad decisions. Let's tackle less incentives. Panel, we find this simply not true. Because what they fail to tell you on their side of the debate is in the current status quo, countries such as the USA, which is actually the major contributor and has the most shares within the current status quo, is preventing China to actually donate more than it currently does within the current status quo. It is preventing any country within the current status quo to donate even more money than they're doing currently. Because the more money you put into the system, the more voting power. And the United States does not want to lose the voting power that they currently have over the system. They lose on the very first factor. But they also fail to lose on this less incentive. When they fail to understand is the very minute that now every single person's opinion is actually being heard, where the people are now going to be more incentivized to actually donate into the World Bank. Because in the current status quo, they know no matter how much money the amount of money they donate, at the end of the day, the USA will still dominate. At the end of the day, the USA will still be the one that actually determines what is the outcome of their development and the outcomes of their policies panel, and that in itself is problematic. They tell us bad decisions. They come to this conclusion because they fail to understand to answer our POI panel. What they're saying is that there's nobody in Morocco or there's nobody in Tanzania that is actually smart enough to consult in things such as loans, that is actually smart enough to consult things such as management, that is actually smart enough to consult things such as interest rates. The very minute that they say this panel, we tell you it is very funny. They're saying that every developing nation doesn't have people that are actually smart enough and actually capable of putting into solutions. In that fact panel, they're buying into the very narrative that the United States has created through the World Bank. But also, they tell you things such as slower decisions. Panel, we rather have slower decisions when every single person on the table actually gets something in return. On their side of the house, they have quick decisions. But what do these quick decisions do? Absolutely nothing. Because at the end of the day, developing nations do not benefit from this decision. Rather, they come up here and tell us, with the current status quo, we have countries such as China trapping these countries and putting them in debt. Panel, we tell you, the reason why these countries such as China are now able to trap these countries into debt is because the very World Bank that they're advocating for, the very policies that it runs it, does not actually give access to certain things and to certain sectors within the developing nations. If Tanzania were to go to the World Bank and ask for things such as to build universities within their country, that will be declined. So where do they go to? They go to China. And because of the World Bank not being able to do this panel, they are literally pushing these people to their death trap. So I find it quite odd that they advocate for development. But that is something I'm going to deal within my substantive. And thirdly, accountability. Panel, let them not come up here and lie to you about accountability, because there is no accountability on their side. For a very long time, the United States and its allies have been running the World Bank, and absolutely nobody has been able to actually combat their decision. Because at the end of the day, panel, what happens in the current status quo is that once the United States bans with even one European, with its European allies, nobody can overrule the decisions that they make, and that in itself is problematic. There is no accountability on their side of the debate. What is my substantive? We tell you, panel, that in this, with the one country, one vote system, we're going to restructure loan priorities from macro to micro economy. What does this mean? In as much as the World Bank has then given us roads, in as much as the World Bank has then given us ports, what happens then is that this will never trickle down to the people and to the development of the people, and that is where it is problematic. Every single thing that this World Bank has been doing has not been for you, nor has it been to facilitate your development, but rather it is to facilitate the development of the multinational companies that exist within your countries, so that they can be able to take away your resources, so that they can be able to extract and exploit you. We tell you, in essence, is problematic. We tell you, we're not saying that we should stop building ports. We're not saying the government should stop building roads. We tell you that the world economy has now become more people-centered, and the World Bank should now be focused on a more balanced approach, rather than just focusing on what they're focusing right now. The reason why this is important, two things. One, it will equip developing nations with youthful workforce, which actually have relevant skills to the currency, to the modern economy. The very minute they do this panel, we actually get development within the currency scope. But also two, it results from the loans we receive being produced to a more inclusive economy that will extend to the tax base within the country. We tell you, what does this look like and how do we get this? We tell you, this looks like developing nations actually getting loans to facilitate and actually to build art state universities within their countries. What this does with the current status quo, because of the lack of funding we've gotten we tell you that the developing nations are now running on old software. And in as much as they want to tell you, is that our countries are now have people and students that don't have the necessary skills, don't have the necessary resources to actually develop modern innovation that will help us in the development within our country. You see, panel, how they have been, the World Bank simply doesn't contribute to our, but also too, it looks like the World Bank giving loans to startup businesses, which will then increase things such as employment, things such as empowering the people with funds to scale up their businesses. That doesn't currently happen within the current status quo. But also, it looks like governments receiving loans to build factories, manufacturing plants. This looks in the current looks like Ghana being one of the largest exporters of gold, becoming one of the largest sellers of gold within our model. Panel, we tell you, if we take this system, we're finally departing from the extractive model that the World Bank has created. What is the difference with the current status with our world and the current status quo? We tell you, in as much as the World Bank gives loans to things such as increased literacy by building primary schools, the problem that then comes up is not you actually bring out graduates. Yes, they can read and write, but they don't have the relative skills for the modern economy. Again, problematic. But also, what happens is that there's going to be large unemployment. There's no fact that developing nations have very high unemployment levels. The reason this happens is because in as much what then happens is that many educated people are now on these very roads that you're saying these World Bank people have built. What happens is the educated people, young educated people, are the ones selling water bottles to pass-buyers. And then we tell you that we simply cannot happen. We tell you, this is the legacy of the World Bank for 80 years. What it has been doing, it has been banked on on policies and things that in the hope that it will help the people, rather than focusing on helping the people. And we tell you that is problematic. We tell you, at least on our side of the debate, we get a relevant workforce. At least on our side of the debate, we're giving these economies a chance to shape their destiny. We're giving them an opportunity to achieve real economic development, and it's something that they'll never be able to avoid.
During this debate, Proposition has kept on talking about fairness. They are prioritizing this fairness and its superficial displays when this picture-perfect mirage hides much deeper issues. In my speech, I will be doing 4 things. First, rebuttal, and then rebuilding our case. Thirdly, our final argument, which is about accountability. And finally, we will do some weighing. So starting with rebuttal. About their first argument, they tell us about economic equity. They tell us about how in their world, when all countries get the same amount of votes, that it will somehow lead to economic equity. Your policy doesn't just give developing countries an equal vote. Why should Malta, Luxembourg, Angola, Qatar, Bahrain get an equal vote when they aren't likely to contribute or get much money in return at all? But then also, we also told you in our first speaker about expertise, and you somehow interpreted that as having expertise is somehow just us diminishing of what a developing or underdeveloped countries is capable of doing, as if we're saying that these countries are capable of having brains or having knowledge about these things. When we told you that expertise isn't just reliant on wealth, expertise is also reliant about your experience in institutions such as the World Bank, which the US have and which other wealthy countries don't have, and these wealthy countries do not have as much of a say in the World Bank organization. But then on their second argument about fairness, about how we have oppression on our side, they don't have a say, they tell us. However, when it comes to loans or projects in specific countries, recipient countries already have a stronger say and can just reject proposals that they do not agree with. This also makes logical sense. Why is that? Because developed countries have an interest to listen to these developing and underdeveloped countries' interests. However, Proposition misunderstands the nature of what their model is actually doing. Their reforms would see developed countries that are not contributing as much have an equal say as developing countries that are having these loans given to them and these projects being done on their ground. Now that I'm done with rebuttal, let's do a bit of rebuilding. So first, on the first argument that my my first speaker has given you about less funding, they have basically given very little response to what why they would have less funding on their world. They tell us that actually on our world there is not more funding because the U.S. is basically controlling all the voting power, meaning that these other countries do not have incentive to increase their voting. What we tell you is that there is this incentive because as much as the U.S. has the most voting power, these countries would also like to have more voting power. You forget that the trend in the last years is that these countries have increased their voting simply because there is an incentive, while on their side there is no incentive to increase funding. Why is that? Because then you get no more benefits. And we don't say these benefits. Yes, I will take that.
Is the opposition saying that rich people in a country should have the same for the country?
This POI just means, this point of information just shows how you have not listened to a word of our case. Why do we say that these wealthy countries, that these developed countries should have a say over these countries? The first argument has already dealt with that. We have dealt with how much experience these countries have, but not only that, but also how they have incentive to make sure that these countries, that the projects being done in these countries are being carried out well. While in underdeveloped and developing countries, they don't have as much experience, and leaving these matters to their hands, which is actually not what your model is doing in the first place. Leaving this in their hands would actually lead to bad decisions. But this is not what your model is doing in the first place, because your model is not giving them as much vote. They don't have actually as much more control. They don't have as much control as you claim that they do. But then, moving on with now that I finished rebuttal, moving on to our final argument in our case, which is about accountability. So this argument will explain that proposition's policy will lead to far less accountable decisions. In the status quo, we think that the World Bank generally does make good decisions. However, we can see that countries sometimes act imperfectly, which is why it is important to have mechanisms of accountability. There are three reasons. No, I'll not take that. There are three reasons why we believe decisions will be far less accountable in proposition's world. First, about external scrutiny. As we already mentioned in first speech, the countries with larger financial contributions do get to have more voting power and more influence on decision making. And because of that, they are more likely to get scrutinized, not only by the international community, but by their population for starters, but also from the from international institutions. And they are closely monitored for potential conflicts of interest, unfair advantage, or the prioritization of self-interest over the broader development objectives. This doesn't exist on proposition's side, and they blame us for not having accountability on our side. They are bound to get more attention from civil society groups as well as the media. This means that to avoid negative scrutiny, contributors are far better incentivized to make better and transparent decisions. And more likely to be called out if their influence is harmful to the countries that they're funding. This changes in proposition's world, where that scrutiny is diluted amongst a much larger group of voters, where it is harder to pinpoint and investigate countries if they are at fault. But then the second reason is about the World Bank Organization institutional mechanisms. World Bank Organization have their own oversight mechanisms to ensure accountability. They do require a lot of financing, a lot of funding. These mechanisms are then threatened on proposition's side because at first speech we highlighted that donors have far less incentive to fund the World Group when they're not getting much benefit out of it. This doesn't just affect development projects or loans, but it also worsens these internal functioning in the World Bank Organization, these oversight mechanisms within the World Bank. But then last reason, to expand upon the point that my first speaker made, if contributors feel more secure funding developing projects or loans unilaterally instead of not through the World Bank Organization, because then they will have to get more say into this, this will be far less accountable because they will not be fed by the World Bank Organization's various processes as well as by other countries. This opens up the door to less secure funding, projects and loans that have more abusive conditions and self-interested conditions, similar to what we've already seen with countries like China that have little to no accountability, mechanisms due to their funding unilaterally. So what are the impacts of this argument? Bad decisions sometimes happen, but at least on our side, we have a safety net for when these mistakes do occur, to not only reverse them, but make sure that they are not happening again. World Bank Organization That means that it is in the best interest of these countries getting funding for their development projects. Now, let's move on, finally, my speech with Wayne. First, on likelihood, our impacts are more certain, as we have given you several mechanisms to go by for each of our arguments, in the context of a system that is already working in status quo. Meanwhile, proposition has taken a massive gamble that countries will not react negatively and cannot prove that funding will not dry up. But that second, on magnitude of impact, our benefits touch the most people in developing and underdeveloped countries. It gives their citizens necessary resources and infrastructure and funds to be able to live out a decent life and carry out their projects, while crops benefits may bring an image of fairness and putting all countries on the same level. If you take a random citizen from Morocco or Tanzania and you ask them what they would prefer more, having more infrastructure projects or loans, or getting an equal vote in an institution that they probably have never heard of, they would probably choose the latter. Proud to close.
Opposition's case would actually make sense if we would see changes in status quo. 80 years since the World Bank has been in place, and the objectives have been in place. Is there shared prosperity? No. Is there accountability, shared accountability? No. Is there shared prosperity? No. And is poverty eliminated? No. You see, panel, if maybe on their side of the house, if they defend status quo, their job was to then show us how exactly these developing nations are now thriving because of the World Bank Group, and how exactly the policies that were put in place because of them and these loans and infrastructure, how exactly they help these countries and how they're developing in that matter. Before I move on to my areas of clash, I would like to make a few points of clarity in one key strategic mistake that was made by side opposition throughout this debate. On the first of which, right, in Badr's speech, we tell you 3 key problems with status quo. Note that the first problem that Badr tells you about they're not achieving the current objectives of A, eliminating poverty, and B, promoting shared prosperity. They do not, at any point in any of the first 2 speeches, they do not challenge us, which means that they concede to the fact that status quo is not achieving its objectives. However, on their side of the house, they also want to tell us that, well, there is infrastructure and this. However, there isn't necessarily a link between the objectives that are put in place and the current system and how exactly that works towards doing that. But we tell you that there's also bad politics. I'll get into that more in my analysis of the clashes. And we tell you about the lack of shared accountability. Again, I will give you more of that on the analysis. Panel, I want to clarify one key thing. On our side of the house, we're not telling you that we're going to have a perfect world. And we're not telling you that there aren't going to be any disadvantages. What we are trying to tell you, though, is that the disadvantages, A, are symmetrical, because if there weren't any disadvantages in status quo, we wouldn't really be having this debate in the first place. But also, on our side of the house, we want more progress. We want the change that will account for A, justice, B, equality, and C, and very crucially, the empowerment of nations, which doesn't exist in status quo. Onto then my 2 areas of clash. Firstly, on the principal justification, and secondly, on politics under that, a little bit more on the incentives. On the first of which, on the principal justification. So their initial principle here is that developing countries have a say currently. But what we're telling you on our side of the house is that this is not enough. We want the developing nations as the biggest stakeholders in this debate, the ones that are going to be affected the most. Remember, these policies go into these developing nations the most. Because they are the biggest stakeholders in this debate, we then tell them that on our side of the house, they should in fact have the most say in where the money goes. Secondly, they tell you that on our side, on their side of the house, they tell you that there will be bad decisions because of lack of expertise and we lack necessary resources. Panel, this is exactly what we're trying to tell you that has been happening in status quo. We lack the necessary resources because of systems that exist in status quo, like the current voting system that exists. We tell you that there is, the experience that we don't have in these organizations is because we've been these things that they do have been existing for some time. We tell you that on our side of the house, number one, we're not going to send people that are stupid. Each country sends people that are experts. Each country sends people that know their country the most. You cannot tell me that some Tom from the US knows more about Tanzania than Mama Samia Suluhu. That just doesn't exist. What do we then get from their side of the house? They also tell us, well, at the end of the day, we can't principally justify it because it's going to be slow decision making. As Calvin tells you very well in her speech, we would rather have the decisions be slow but thorough. What we want on our side of the house is we want for the decisions that be made to be made towards actually helping other countries. As Calvin tells you very well in her speech, it is no point of you building a road if the people of the country are simply going to be selling water by the side of those roads. We want the economic system that is being made to be more people-centered. Why is this very crucial? It needs to be more people-centered because these people, the lack of expertise is because of the current voting system. When you are able to then educate these people, state-of-the-art facilities in universities, you're then able to increase the economy. You see, their side of the house trying to tell you that these roads they're helpful. If these roads are really were as helpful as they say, then they would have given us at least 2 examples of developing nations that are now developed because of the World Bank Group and the incentives that you get on their side of the house. What do they then tell you as well? They tell you that there will be no accountability. We tell you this very well in Badr's speech, that the president of the World Bank is always a U.S. national. For 80 years, we always have a U.S. national. When do we then have accountability? But if also accountability was very true, logically, then these failed objectives that currently exist would have been accounted for on their side of the house. You would then be able to hold these countries accountable for not meeting the very objectives that they set themselves. On to the second of which is that the last justification that they give us on principally why we should continue with the system is that, I spoke to this earlier in my speech, but that is infrastructure is there. But what they're also telling us is that they're very okay with the bare minimum. And they're also telling us, they concede to the fact that, yes, we need these big countries to develop, and because they're giving us the bare minimum, that should be okay. We simply tell you that that is not true. We tell you that the infrastructure that they bring is because of an extractive economic model. And we tell you this very well in Badr's speech. And we tell you that this is not people-centered. We give you a very thorough analysis on Calvin's speech as well as to why exactly they don't develop these countries in a way that it actually helps them. On to then the second clash on the politics and under that incentives. So what they tell you on their side of the house, and we get this very largely from the 2 first speeches, is that there will be no incentives because the money will not go towards their goals. Panel, these goals are the goals we tell you on our side of the house, the goals to take our resources, the goals to take our minerals. If they really wanted to actually work towards helping out these countries to bring shared prosperity, to eliminate poverty, then poverty would have already been eliminated. But then also, we're telling you that the incentive should be able to continue if they actually want to help out these countries. Because if your main goal is to actually bring shared prosperity and to eliminate poverty, you would have no problem in putting your money into it because you know that it's going to help out the countries and you know it's going to help you then achieve your objectives. But then they also continue consistently telling you, especially in their second speech, where they want to contribute if they don't have a say. Panel, the one country, one vote system doesn't mean they don't have a say. They're still going to have a say and they're still going to speak. But what we also tell you that if they pull out of the funding because of us, simply because of our system, are they not conceding that they have a coercive control over the countries and they prefer that system because of that coercive control in the first place? Onto then, finally, what are we left with in this debate, right? Firstly, they haven't been able to properly justify why exactly the one country, one vote system shouldn't be in place. Because on our side of the house, we tell you, and their case really falls apart when they bank on the harms, forgetting the marginal benefits that you get on our side of the house, especially when we talk about the progress that you would get in terms of A, developing countries, and B, meeting the objectives of the World Bank in itself. And then lastly, we give you one more principle justification that is yet to be engaged with by opposition. We told you very well in Bander's speech about the principle justification of commonwealth. We tell you that in commonwealth, under that number one, these countries pay interest back. Now what's funny about this is that they pay the most interest back, high interest, yet they don't have a say in how their country is run. That being said, panel, I am incredibly proud to propose.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2. I'm impressed. I'm impressed with how opposition carries themselves, how they speak, how their debating skills are. Unfortunately, I'm less impressed with what you say. And this is for a few reasons. There are fatal flaws in what they say and problems in their case that illustrate how on proposition's world we present better outcomes for low-income, for middle-income countries, and for high-income countries. As a third speaker, I will be doing 4 things to show you why that's the case. Firstly, I will be outlining the tactical flaws that they've made within their case. Secondly, I will be rebuilding the case, my case that they tried to so shoddily destroy. And thirdly, I will rebuttal some of the arguments they've made to ultimately prove to you why we shouldn't change the system and the current voting system in the World Bank is good as it is. So first, they've made a few tactical flaws. You failed to show us why you'd have more or equal funding on your side. No, this is important because as a non-profit banking organization, funding is ultimately how power is displayed, how that funding goes through networks to end up in the pockets of countries to be able to fund projects, to be able to develop themselves. Secondly, you've ignored how, on your case, countries, low-income and middle-income countries would be more prone to go into China for predatory loans and ending up in debt traps. And you failed to illustrate how current countries are dissatisfied with how the model is and that there is an actual demand to change the current proportional system to a one-country system. That's very important since you claim that you speak for the voice of low and middle-income countries, yet you failed to illustrate how they actually want that now. And then you didn't implement a precise policy that perfectly illustrates how this is going to take place, how to avoid instability, how to avoid dissatisfaction that will go against the spirit of peace and international cooperation that the World Bank is built on, and how it will avoid the corruption that would be much more easy with a one country, one vote system. With all of that in mind, what did they say about our case? First, they say that the World Bank is oppressive. Because one of their first arguments was that the USA currently dominates the system. While the USA have about 18% of the share of votes, we believe that saying that constitutes domination is vastly exaggerated and doesn't illustrate anything about how that funding goes, the quality of the funding being used, I'll take it later, and whether it actually helps low-income countries to develop. They also say that because Europe and the USA are abandoned, then if they come together, then ultimately there's that domination, so European and American goals are the only ones being explicitly stated within the World Bank. We believe this is wrong, since in the past 10 years, developing countries that have managed to accumulate more of a share within the World Bank have also been able to express themselves. This is China, this is South Korea, this is Japan, this is other countries that aren't explicitly aligned with the West's goals, which aren't also explicitly bad, and also end up in the pockets of low-income and middle-developing countries. They also say that we don't fund relevant projects. Now, what are relevant projects to you? Are hydropower dams not relevant projects? Are universities not relevant projects? Are road networks not relevant projects? Are electrical grids not relevant projects? I'll stop this tangent, because I've illustrated to you that actually the World Bank, already the existence of the existence of an international banking organization that acts and funds these projects is already good enough. We find that on your side, it is rather an ungrace towards this funding that is being put towards these goals. They also say that there's no link between the objectives that the World Bank stands for and the actual reality. We believe that's wrong, since if you look at the statistics, one of the first speakers said that, well, why don't we have general prosperity today? Because general prosperity is, first of all, an ideal that may never be reached because countries will always strive for better. And second of all, the World Bank has been efficient as its main goal, which is improving funding access for low-income and developing countries. This has been shown by extreme reductions in extreme poverty statistics and other such metrics that measure economic success. You can see continents like Africa and Asia, which have seen the most improvement thanks to better management on their part, and also thanks to better access to funding from international organizations, alias the IMF and the World Bank. Now I will move on to some rebuttals. They speak about economic equity and how it's so important. First of all, the current World Bank and what it pursues have been successful in putting projects on the ground and acting towards the interests of these countries. We believe that this economic inequity that is present is not due to the World Bank, and it's not in the World Bank control. This is due to other reasons present within the region, such as demographic, religious, ethnic problems that cause issues and are not within the scope of the World Bank. I will be taking a video on it. Please be quick.
Yes. Name two countries that have benefited, name two countries that have moved from developing to developed due to the World Bank.
I was going to say that. So, two countries that have moved from developing to developed are Japan and South Korea, which are countries that have benefited immensely from World Bank and have actually increased their proportional vote today and are more incentivized to vote because they know that this funding helps countries develop and in exchange helps them get a more meritocratic position within the organization. So, thank you. So secondly, the current system is crucial and has been an important win-win system for higher income countries which get a say in how economic systems are structured, and also low and middle income countries which get funding that can go towards projects that I won't go into right now. So, I also say that the one country, one vote system adds unnecessary bureaucratic weight, and you fail to prove why not, since when you have proportional voting, it's rather easy to not only put countries to scrutiny when bad decisions are made, but it's also, the organization is also not as complex as the shift and the actual one country, one vote system. Secondly, you speak about inclusivity and representation. We believe that this is irrelevant considering the existence of institutions that already act for inclusivity and representation. Say the United Nations has been a crucial force for having each country have a vote and be able to present their political views in the context of an economic banking organizations. We don't see why economic inclusivity is as important as other arguments like funding and like how that funding gets used, which you've proven and illustrated. No, I'm not taking it. Which we've proven and illustrated why it's been done rather well. Now, it's also rather idealistic and ignores the inherent corruption that would occur in your system, given that when you have one vote in one country, you can look back to other systems like the United Nations that I've spoken about earlier, wherein people have been able to buy votes to make bad decisions. How do you illustrate that that will not happen if the World Bank ends up making even worse decisions? What is there to your case? Nothing. Now you also say that there's no trickle-down development within our system. Now, this ignores the reality of development, which is that Rome is not built in a day. It takes ages for a country to go from relying on the primary sector, agriculture, mining, to being able to develop a workforce for industry, to being able to develop a service-based economy. This won't happen in 20 years because the World Bank suddenly has a one country, one vote system, and there will be trillions of dollars put into it. You're vastly over-exaggerating the amounts of funding that are present within the World Bank, actually, and the fact that it's not a country. It is a pragmatic institution that has very limited profits, as it is a non-profit organization, meaning it cannot control all aspects of countries. It cannot fund education, the education of hundreds of countries, of all of the 100 countries that need it. And for all of those reasons, and the fact I do not need to shout, I do not need to wave my hands, the sheer power of my voice and the truth it carries, and for all of those reasons, I am very proud to oppose and thank you.
Is there more accountability on opposition side? Is there more transparency on opposition side? Is there more accountability on our side? These are the questions that Proposition has asked us in their first speech. But they don't tell us why these things do exist on their side. In my speech, I will summarize this debate in 3 clashes. First clash about having a say versus less funding. Second clash about economic equity versus bad decisions. And last, about accountability. So starting in my first clash, what does Proposition tell us on this clash? They value underdeveloped and developing countries having an equal say as developed countries. But what we will tell about what opposition has told you is that their model doesn't work the way they intended to. Why is that? Because here they are not just given an equal say to underdeveloped and developing countries, but to literally every country that doesn't contribute as much or that doesn't even take loans as much. We recipients, we obviously told you how recipients obviously already have a stronger say also, and how they are able to reject proposals if they don't want to. So this completely negates the claim that Proposition made about higher interest and how they don't have really control over whether they can get the loan or not. Because if they find that these interests are too high for them, they can simply just refuse them. And it's not like there aren't any loans outside of the World Bank. But then but then let me tell you why I think that Proposition doesn't truly care about fairness. Because here, to go back to that point, here we have less funding. So what does it matter if we have an equal say over no funding, over no money? Because we told you how these countries have more of an incentive to pull out and give loans unilaterally, because then it means that they get to have more, because it benefits their interest more, not meaning that they do want to exploit these countries or whatever. In most of the time, these interests, their interests of the developed countries, do align with the interests of developing underdeveloped countries, and we already mentioned that in first speech. But then on the second clash about economic equity versus bad decision, Proposition tells us how having all countries having an equal say will lead to more impact on the economy of underdeveloped and developing countries. To go back, their model is simply not doing what they claim they do. Here, it doesn't mean them having this model doesn't mean that these countries do get to have more of a say over their countries. More than that, it just means that the decisions that will be made are just bad decisions. And Opposition has clearly told you that by 3 distinct mechanisms. First, on less expertise. We told you also how expertise doesn't simply rely on the wealth of the country, on how much money it does get. But then the second mechanism we gave you is about less incentive, about how developed countries do have an incentive incentive to make sure that these projects do work. However, the countries that do not contribute or do not get loans have no incentive to make sure that the decisions, that the votes that they do make benefit the other countries that are getting these contributions. And then on the last mechanism, slower decisions, which proposition has latched on about slower decisions, why they don't matter. We tell you that slower decisions do matter because then it means that these countries do not get to have these development projects that are very necessary for them at that time, which just slows down development. But even if they do, even if slower decisions really do not matter, we have other points that win us this debate. And then finally, the clash on accountability. Somehow proposition claims that accountability will happen on their side because then all these countries somehow start to care more about the other countries. They tell us about how our countries, developed countries, do not have moral incentive to make sure that these projects work, but then somehow all the other countries have a moral incentive to make sure that these projects do work. On this, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Panel, team opposition have already lost this debate. They lost this debate at the very beginning when they concede to the fact that when they say and bring an argument of how countries are less incentivized to now contribute. The US will be less incentivized to now contribute. The minute they said that, panel, they concede to the fact that these countries prefer the existing system because it helps them to justify their development, because it safeguards their interests, because it is a system that oppresses developing nations. The very minute that they say less incentive is the very minute they concede to the fact that the system is in itself oppressive. But yet, they tell us we should continue to don't justify why developed nations should continue being oppressed. Why developed nations, we should live in a world where we should continue being oppressed simply because, the United States simply makes better policies than everybody else. Panel, we find that absolutely not true. But also, panel, we tell you, they lose this debate when they fail to understand that it has been 80 years, panel, 80 years, and that the World Bank has had two objectives: shared prosperity as well as ending poverty, none of which they have been able to achieve. We also tell you they lose this debate when they come up here and tell us that the system we're giving you is wrong, when they fail to justify why the system with an objective of shared prosperity should have only one person in charge of the whole institution. We tell you it's problematic. But they also lose this debate when they come up here and tell us, they contradict their case and say that, developing nations can simply reject these policies. Panel, because the World Bank doesn't give these funds, because they don't give these resources, they then come back to the very same justification and the very same death trap they've been talking about on their side of the debate. This is where the problem lies. Panel, what do we tell you? This debate was about justice. This debate was about fairness. This debate was about giving a voice and leveling the playing field for developing nations. Panel, maybe on their side, maybe in Morocco, they do not have experts who are capable enough and knowledgeable enough to make interest rates, to consult in things such as loan. Maybe in their country, but I'll tell you, panel, Tanzania has these experts who are very much capable. Other developing nations have these experts who are very much capable in actually assisting these policies, panel. So when they tell us bad decisions, we tell you that is simply not true. But they also tell you that even if this were to be true, bad decisions exist on both sides of the house. Because in the current status quo, the World Bank has made bad decisions. We can give you an example where the privatization of water in Philippines actually made water less accessible in the Philippines. We tell you the problem that they identify already exists with the current status quo. So at least on our panel, where we have inclusivity, where we have equity, we offer you much more than they will ever bring you to this side of the debate. But also, panel, they come up here and tell us that contributing nations do not contribute as much. Panel, again, they lose this debate because they have absolutely no idea how the World Bank functions. They lose the debate when they fail to understand that the World Bank is actually thriving on interest from developing nations. Yet they fail to justify that why these people who are contributing the most to the funding of the World Bank through interest rate, should not have a say in policies that affect them, in policies that will affect their people, kind of. For far too long has the World Bank been used as a tool to exploit developing nations. For far too long have we not been given the voice. For far too long have we not been given the ability to prosper economically. For far too long have we been exploited. And we tell you, panel, we simply cannot go through this. We tell you, what we tell you is that regardless of the outcome, the oppressive system is unjustified. And because it is just unjustified, whether this outcome is good, whether it's bad, the very fact that this oppressive system exists in itself is a bad thing, and it's something that can simply not stand within the current status quo. I don't know.